predominantly I'm in the earth science and physics related fields, and when it comes to representation, both for women and people of color, it's one of the most poorly diverse or poorly represented fields of the natural sciences. And I think that that's really a challenge because I think it's cultural. And in particular in earth sciences, to me, and I think there's some literature about this as well, some of the barriers are that earth science is a field discipline. And the field can bring a lot of challenges in terms of, especially for women's experiences of sexual harassment and discrimination. It's a very ableist environment. And so I think that there are a lot of challenges in navigating that and sort of the intersectionality of that and how folks are represented. And there's a lot of also safety problems and I think a lot of white supremacy culture that makes its way into field dynamics and attitudes. And I think that can really be a challenge because a lot of times, especially for undergraduate majors, students are required to go through those processes and those field classes in order to get their degree, and that can be a real barrier. So I think that's one place where that's a barrier. But then even when you get into grad school for research, whether it's earth sciences or oceanography, these are things that persist. So I think those continue to be challenges in terms of culture. It's hard, I think, oftentimes for people to feel a sense of belonging, and so we will lose a lot of people for that. Or even when especially for women or anybody who is taking caretaking roles, it can be a challenge to have to leave for multiple weeks at a time to go to sea, and sometimes just isn't a possibility. And so there's, I think, barriers that come with that. And then, I think a lot of the commonalities among the sciences in terms of representation, in terms of attitude, even just in how we do science and sort of the academic culture around that.
So I want to hear now a little bit about how you found your life's work and what you're interested in and, how you came to it.
I grew up in Rhode Island. My dad's an Iranian Armenian, my mother's American, and I lived there until I was about 19 before I moved to San Diego for school. I studied math in undergrad. I bounced around between various majors, but math was always the consistent one because, I don't know, I think I found it really interesting. I really liked the problem-solving aspect of it. And I studied pure math. I thought there are a lot of concepts in it that are really beautiful in terms of the connectedness. But I wasn't really sure that that's what I wanted to do long term. And then I took an earth science class by chance with a friend as an elective that was geology of national parks. And I totally fell in love with it because it feels really tangible, so you can learn about earth processes and things that are happening either on timescales that you can watch and see, or sometimes things that you just have to imagine. And then you can go out and see them and touch them. And I just thought that sort of tangible nature of it and interconnectedness of the system is really interesting. And so then I was trying to figure out what to do after that and decided to go to grad school. And so I decided to go into geophysics because it was a nice way to marry the math background and problem solving with earth science. And specifically, a lot of the things I'd been exploring the previous few years were oceanography related. And so I decided I wanted to do just marine geophysics for the connection to the ocean, which I think is, to me personally, a special place that I find connectedness. And then I think scientifically there are a lot of things that are interesting and beautiful about it and really dynamic. And so then I went to grad school in San Diego at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography to study marine geophysics. And specifically I was studying faults that were underwater offshore Southern California.
So tell us a little bit about why oceans were special to you, and then beginning to specialize looking at oceans from the perspective of geophysics, what new things reveal themselves?
Yeah, well, in terms of why the ocean's special to me, I think some of it is just family history. Rhode Island is the ocean state, and so there's really easy access to the ocean. There's I think a history of being connected to it in my family for a few generations. And to me, it just feels like a place where I think it's maybe the only probably place where I find sort of like a spiritual connection, because it feels like you're connected to the physical forces that are driving waves that you can literally feel in your body when you're in them. There's a lot of life in the oceans, and I think that to me is really beautiful and special.
And so then, while you were working on learning this field, how did you find your way to like your little piece of it, what you specifically researched?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of what I researched in grad school, is really chance. It's what advisor has what funding for what project. And I got really lucky to work on a couple of projects that were offshore related. And one of the things that I think was interesting to me about it is that it has the marine geophysics component to it, but because you're studying faults underwater, they're very close to shore. They present a significant seismic hazard. And moving to Southern California, I, for the first time in my life, felt earthquakes. And in fact, I felt the magnitude 7.2 El Mayor Cucapa earthquake that happened in, I think, 2010. And that was really impressionable. Like, these are forces that the ground, which is the thing that should be the most stable, is all of a sudden moving. And it's in that particular case where I lived, there was no damage and everything was fine. But I think being able to study something that I can see also has some kind of impact in terms of, I can anticipate this, and I also want to think about how do I make sure that we mitigate the effects of this. That was something that was really exciting and interesting to me, to have that sort of connection to it. And then I think things that I really liked about it in terms of discovery is when you're looking at these faults, oftentimes, you're looking at things that are miles underneath the surface. And so it's a pretty cool feeling to look at the data that comes back and realize that this is something you don't typically see, So it's a pretty cool experience to be able to say, like, oh my gosh, I can actually see this process and see this thing that's happening so far beneath our feet, and recognize this thing that holds so much force and power and potential impact for us.
And yet seems so invisible.
And seems
That's
so
really
invisible.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So when did you come to the U of O?
I came to the U of O in 2018. So in between grad school and coming here, I did a postdoc at the U.S. Geological Survey in the Earthquake Science Center. And that's where I transitioned to doing from mostly marine geophysics to doing things that are predominantly related to seismic hazard. So seismic hazard is what is the likelihood of experiencing shaking? So the hazard is the shaking. That's the thing that can potentially cause damage. And so I became really interested in, we always talk about, these faults pose hazard, but what is the rest of the piece of the puzzle? How do you go from knowing that there's a fault down there that can create an earthquake of this size to having some kind of estimate that you can use to mitigate risk and plan? What is the sort of the process and series of steps in between? And so in my postdoc, I focused on one of the other pieces of that puzzle, which is what are the things that have an effect on how strong shaking is, and how do we estimate that ahead of time so that we can better say, in this area, the shaking will be this strong, which means that you need to design structures in this way. Because one of these phrases that we will often use is that it's not it's not earthquakes that hurt people, it's buildings that hurt people. So the ground itself moving doesn't really affect us, it's the structures around us. And so if you can understand what's the best way to make sure that they don't experience damage or fall, then that's how you mitigate the risk. And so that's what I studied in the postdoc, and came here in 2018 and started working on research related to sort of all of those pieces of my background.
I'm very interested in how you said that the sorts of findings you generate helps building, right? So how does that research make its way into something like urban policy, etc.?
Well, it takes a long time. So in terms of how the research makes its way, there's a lot of series of processes and a lot of different agencies that have to be involved, and even disciplines in order to do that. So the primary thing is, a lot of times what we do in the academic field is more on the basic science side of things. And so we're asking questions about earth processes, why does this process happen? How does it occur like this? A lot of the things we do in seismic hazard require and need that fundamental or basic research to move forward, but a lot of it is really applied. So when it comes to building policy and making its way into planning, the steps are, the spectrum from basic science to applied. The sort of end goal when it comes to the science is being able to estimate how much shaking is going to happen and how frequently. So are you going to get very strong shaking but infrequently? Or are you going to get moderate shaking but pretty frequently? So that's the sort of medium step for seismic hazard. And then from there, we go to estimating the risk. So from there, it's saying, okay, well, if I have a building that I'm going to put here, how do I design it such that it's going to withstand the shaking that I expect on average over the lifetime of the building?
Right.
So for buildings we live and work in, that might be 50 years. For things like bridges or other critical facilities, it might be thousands of years, the 1 in 1,000 year or 2,000 year event we plan for. And so from there, there's sort of a series of then processes where there's a lot of policy and engineering. So there's the American Society of Civil Engineers that comes up with building codes that are based on the most recent vetted information of seismic hazard. So that takes 5 to 10 years to get to a vetted model of what the seismic hazard is. And then they will incorporate that into updates to the building code. So for example, here in the Northwest, we learned at some point, indigenous folks who've been living here for time immemorial have known forever that there are earthquakes, but at least when settlers came, they mostly sort of ignored that traditional knowledge. And so it really wasn't until the 1980s that we knew that earthquakes occurred here.
Wow.
In our Western culture. And so it's only been the last several decades that we've been working on updating building codes here. So this is, I think, an example where, the science over the course of a few decades starts to make its way into better estimates of seismic hazard. But as you start to understand the hazard better, you have to update the building codes because now you realize, actually stronger shaking can happen here than we thought.
Wow.
And then once those building codes happen, there's still a lot of series of steps that we need to think about in terms of making a more resilient society, because it's not just the buildings themselves. It's also our networks and our infrastructure. It's recognizing that there's still going to be damage and impacts and effects. And so how do you plan to make sure that you can recover from those quickly, that you can get resources to places that you need? And so that's sort of the other end of the spectrum, which is the emergency response and planning side of things. And so they'll take all of that very vetted information from hazard and engineers, and they will then work with that to make plans for what we should do before an earthquake.
Yeah.
And so some of the things that I've been interested in and working on the last few years here with the Cascadia Region Earthquake Science Center is I lead the partnerships and applications branch of the center. And one of the things we're focused on is trying to make connections with scientists and agencies that are working in that entire spectrum of things across the region to figure out, are there places where the science that we're doing can contribute to improving any of those estimates or lead to collaborations that can improve our resilience? And if so, how do we maybe reframe some of the science questions that we're asking so that they address that in a more direct way?
Can you maybe give us one example of one such reframing?
This is not seismology related, this is more tsunami related, but one of the and we have large earthquakes here in Cascadia, we'll get tsunamis that come in on the coast. And there are a lot of communities that are going to be severely impacted because they're entirely in the inundation zone. And so when you map out walk times and evacuation times, a lot of people in those communities will not make it out of the inundation zone before the tsunami arrives. Mm-hmm. And so some of the things that have happened over the last few years is thinking about building tsunami evacuation structures, which are structures that are built and they stay there, and that instead of needing to go to higher ground, you go to the structure and you climb up it. Mm-hmm. So I think some examples of reframing those science questions are saying, okay, well, we're not going to study just the process in the tsunami anymore, and we recognize that we need to have really good estimates of what is the inundation going to be and where, so that we can determine where do we put these tsunami evacuation structures. Mm-hmm. And that requires also partnership with people that are doing the planning for building the structures and where do we put them.
I wanted to hear a little bit about the classes you teach and how you engage students in some of these broader issues that are of interest to you, that are not just research specific, but also directions in which the field is headed.
Yeah. Well, I teach a few different classes. I teach some of our non-major science classes, like Intro to Oceanography. Mm-hmm. I teach our first series class for Earth Sciences. It's essentially physical Earth Sciences, or dynamic planet Earth is what it's called. Mm-hmm. And so in that class, we'll talk about a lot of the basic concepts of, how did the universe form and the Earth, and what are plate tectonics, what are the types of rocks and things like that. And so I'll try and bring in pieces of humanity into that. Yes. As it's related. So sometimes it's the researchers themselves, but especially as we get to the natural hazards part of it and thinking about the landscape, trying to tie in, we have a connection to this landscape because we live on it, and so we interact with these processes. I also teach a couple of upper level grad classes. So I teach a programming class for earth scientists, and then a seismology class. Yeah. And I think in particular in the programming class, that's a really great example or a really great class to bring in real world examples, because it's focused on how do you code, what is an algorithm, things like that. But at the end of the day, the reason that we're using it is to have a tool in our kit that we can use to analyze the world, our
Yes.
findings in the world, and then what do we do with them? And so I'll try and bring in examples of data sets that are, they're science data sets, but that also have some kind of impact. Or rather connection to humanity. So there are some that we'll look at that are related to storm surge, and trying to think about what does this look like in different places, for hurricanes and different communities. So not just thinking about it as the data itself, but thinking about, how do you analyze it based on your interests, who's asking the science question,
Yes,
kind of
yes.
thing. So I try and have projects, data sets, and examples like that. And then I also try and take opportunities in the class itself to, I guess, have students bring in their own perspectives and experience. So when, they get to choose a project for the class, I give them pretty free rein on what they want to do with that. It doesn't even have to be earth science related. And I think that those are good examples because they get to see that if there's something that I'm interested in, I can use this tool to essentially be something to help me figure out that problem. And so instead of seeing it as just, here's the formula of basic science questions that we ask and it has to be process related, instead say, this is a tool, programming is a tool, but the problem solving and the way that you ask questions is also a tool. And so what is something that matters to you and that you care about, and how can you use these tools towards that?